Thank you so much, Professor Tarquini, for starting us off so splendidly and also in time. Our second speaker is Professor Anson Rabinbach, who is the Philip and Beulah Rollins Professor of History at Princeton University and a founding editor of New German Critique. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1973. He'd been a fellow at the American Academy Berlin, a Fulbright senior scholar at Smolny College, St. Petersburg, a fellow at the Institute for 20th Century History in Jena, at the Simon Dubnow Institute in Leipzig, and at the Internationales Forschungszentrum Kulturwissenschaften in Vienna in 2013. His research focuses on the cultural intellectual history of modern Europe, and among his books are The Crisis of Austrian Socialism, From Red Vienna to Civil War, 1927 to 1934, The Human Motor, Energy, Fatigue, and the Origins of Modernity, In the Shadow of Catastrophe, German Intellectuals Between Apocalypse and Enlightenment. He's also published a documentary history of Nazi Germany, the Third Reich Sourcebook, co-edited with Sander Gilman, and his most recent book was Staging the Third Reich, Essays in Cultural and Intellectual History.
Thank you. I think that's good. George Mosse avoided the concept of totalitarianism and almost never used it. In a 1976 interview, he said, "I am opposed to totalitarianism because the liberal point of view uses totalitarianism as a general catchphrase for anything that is anti-liberal." In The Nationalization of the Masses, he called the concept misleading. However, on one occasion, he did give it serious consideration. At a 1982 Jerusalem colloquium on the memory of Jacob Talmon, he outlined his objections. Published in 1952 and less well known than Hannah Arendt's Origins, Talmon's Origins of Totalitarian Democracy is one of the genre's earliest and most influential works. Indebted to political theory, Talmon argued that the Enlightenment and the French Revolution created totalitarian democracy. Notions of the perfectibility of mankind, Rousseau's general will, and popular sovereignty inspired the Jacobins and were ultimately realized in the menace of Bolshevism. Though Mosse agreed that the French Revolution began a new age of mass politics, he rejected Talmon's claim that the Enlightenment and the Revolution created totalitarian democracy because, Mosse said, the concept of totalitarianism actually stood in the way of understanding the new political style. Instead, he argued that it was the aspiration of romantic irrationalism to realize a new totality of life through the emotional integration of individuals in a collective entity. That was the basis for aggressive nationalism in the 20th century. It was not, Mosse argued, merely a child of the Cold War. Totalitarianism has always been a protean term, capable of combining and recombining meanings in different contexts and in new, ever-changing political constellations. The major theorists of totalitarianism adopted a term that had a long history before it acquired the patina of academic respectability. It's very difficult to pinpoint precisely what is distinctive about totalitarianism. Is it, as some of its first theorists insisted, compelling shorthand to demonstrate that modern tyranny, because it is more invasive, more reliant on the total assent of the masses, and more reliant on terror than old-fashioned despotism? Or is it a project, as Hannah Arendt famously argued, in fabricating an atomized humanity according to the laws of biology or history? Or is it an ideal type in the Weberian sense to which no real dictatorship conforms? Could it be redefined as an experiment in political domination undertaken by a revolutionary movement rather than a regime, as Emilio Gentile has recently suggested? Finally, is it a sign of ontological confusion in Slavoj Žižek's provocative formulation? Totalitarianism belongs to a select number of concepts adaptable to whatever ideologies, regimes, or social structures they claim to describe. Often they straddle the divide between politics and academia. They can also recruit successive generations because they are existential, creating personal, professional, and political identities. They are potentially explosive and by nature unstable, with an elasticity required for repurposing past and present new circumstances. Claude Lefort, one of its most discerning analysts, concluded that totalitarianism is a mutation of the symbolic order. To better understand the genealogy of the totalitarian concept, let me briefly consider 4 historical phases, or as I prefer, moments, which are by no means the only ones possible. As you know, the totalitarian system was invented here in Italy by one of Mussolini's earliest opponents and victims, Giovanni Amendola. From his perspective, totalitarianism refers to any government that disregards the 2 foundations of any democracy, the rights of the minority and the rule of the majority. During the 1930s, anti-fascist and anti-totalitarians created an alliance against fascism and quasi-fascist regimes throughout Europe and America. Popular Front alliances were not homogeneous. They included Christian socialists, liberals, as well as Comintern functionaries. In Britain, these movements brought together luminaries like the future Archbishop of Canterbury with exiles like the teenager George Mosse, who attended political lectures and collected milk money for the Spanish Republicans. Before it entered the scholarly lexicon, the rhetoric of anti-fascism was synonymous with anti-totalitarianism. The 1939 Hitler-Stalin Pact and the combined invasion of Poland by Germany and the USSR shattered the commonly held view that fascism and communism were deadly enemies, and that their hostility was the crux of world politics. The pact confirmed Manus Sperber's judgment that for the entire anti-fascist movement, the Hitler-Stalin Pact meant the greatest political and moral defeat they had ever suffered. Anti-totalitarianism now meant anti-communism. Among the first to oppose the pact tended to be ex-communists, whose experience with the party led them to a re-articulation of the concept during World War II, underscoring the equation between the 2 dictatorships. For example, Franz Borkenhaus, The Totalitarian Enemy, 1940. After the war, the political consensus of the 1930s was reconfigured by the so-called Cold War liberals, many of them former leftists, who eventually united under the banner of liberal anti-communism. In the U.S., not only the anti-Stalinist left of Partisan Review, but religious periodicals like Commonweal and Christian Century were all using the term totalitarianism to link, if not equate, fascism and communism. When the American Philosophical Society held a symposium on the totalitarian state in 1939, the argument had evolved from a focus on the nature of dictators or the economy to a new focus on ideology. Mind you, not to any specific orientation, but to conformity to the will or worldview of the state and a revolt against Western civilization. Post-war anti-totalitarianism became a semantic bridge, enabling former progressives to turn from anti-Nazism to anti-Sovietism. Its revival in the 1950s led to its academic canonization. For example, Brzezinski and Friedrich, The Totalitarian Dictatorship and Autocracy. Sidney Hook, who personified the new liberalism of fear, summed up the moment when he wrote, Whoever believed that Nazi expansionism constituted a threat to the survival of democratic institutions must conclude by the same logic and the same type of evidence that Soviet communism represents today an even greater threat to our survival because the potential opposition to totalitarianism is now much weaker in consequence of World War II. This version of liberalism was cleansed of Enlightenment phantasms of progress, social justice, and emancipation, all associated now with Stalinism. As Norman Podhoretz, editor of the magazine Commentary, recalled, whereas the anti-communist liberals were full of dynamism, elan, and passion that so often accompany a newly discovered way of looking at things, the fellow travelers could marshal nothing but boring cliches and tired arguments. By the late 1960s, however, many scholars abandoned totalitarianism as a Cold War relic. When terror ceased to be the defining feature of Soviet rule and détente replaced containment as U.S. policy, German historians like Michael Geyer, Ian Kershaw, and Richard Overy documented the multiple flaws in the Nazi-Soviet equivalents, as did Sovietologists such as Sheila Fitzpatrick. As Geyer explained, quote, the totalitarian model, with its claim of a monolithic, efficient state and a dogmatically held mind-altering ideology, did not describe historical reality. 10 years after its broad acceptance, one of its former defenders could admit it does not serve the cause of comparative political analysis or political understanding to cling to the concept of totalitarianism. With the concept on the brink of extinction, at least in academia, the collapse of communism reinvigorated it for several reasons. Chief among them was the inability of Soviet-type societies to reform from within or to accomplish any substantial modernization of their disintegrating planned economies. The Eastern European protest movements of the 1970s and 1980s and the eventual end of the Soviet regime in 1991 led dissident intellectuals to adopt the concept, but now with an entirely different emphasis on the fragility of the totalitarian system and the possibilities of resistance. This is especially evident in Václav Havel's The Power of the Powerless, 1979, and Adam Michnik's memorable observation that the Soviet regime was totalitarianism with its teeth kicked out. A newer approach, inspired by Michel Foucault, regards totalitarian power not in terms of states and ideologies, but in everyday experience of culture, governmental institutions, and technologies in the democratic West. Recently, Simona Forti demonstrated that neoliberalism ushers in a new form of totalitarianism, sometimes called biopower, a project for total control as upsetting and frightening as classic totalitarianism was for its victims, end quote. Biopolitical theory is a sophisticated political analysis unconstrained by the old antinomies of left and right, democracy and dictatorship, objective science, and political bias. Instead, these critics understand relations among life, power, and technology and political institutions as the central problem of political theory and philosophy. During the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Adam Michnik once again invoked another moment of totalitarianism. Watching the collapsing World Trade Center towers, he said, made me realize that the world was facing a new totalitarian challenge. Islamist fanaticism and lies were challenging democratic values. As expected, totalitarianism once again performed its role as a semantic bridge between the 1930s, the 1950s, and the 1980s, and its more contemporary uses. Totalitarianism remains as ambiguous today as ever. As a historical concept, it is insecure and contested, geopolitically promiscuous, intellectually nebulous, and always a semantic marker of new political constellations, identities, and ideological alliances. Only that, I think, remains indisputable.